Hello, my name is Paul Worthington. I am the Director of Research and Development here at Lindamood-Bell Learning Processes. I want to thank you for joining us. We're going to be having a conversation that I think will be important as we continue to address the needs of literacy in the United States of America. So stay with me and we'll see if we can't get this done in about 20-25 minutes. And we'll be entertaining once this is broadcast. Any questions that you have, that information will be presented at the end of the presentation. Thank you. So the topic today is looking beyond what's been now commonly referred to as the science of reading. And because we're of the opinion that there's a more systematic way to look at this. Not that there's anything necessarily wrong with what people are referring to as the science of reading, but from a global standpoint, there's much more involved if we're going to move the needle in public education. And of course, the reason for that, we all get paid to address student achievement as a primary factor on addressing the literacy needs of students in the United States. So let's begin. You may all be familiar with this gentleman, Thomas Kuhn. It's an interesting quote because it goes to really asking important questions to move the needle that we're talking about. The answers you get depend upon the questions you ask. And really why that matters is what is it going to take to change literacy levels in the United States? To make the point, you'll remember a few months back, the NAEP scores were released. And what we have here is just a quick summation because what they're measuring at 4th and 8th grade, for example, in the 4th grade, 31% of the students were at above proficient. The bottom line was that this drop was consistent across various performance levels. So in other words, as long as this is being measured, we're not seeing much changes over the decades, and it turns out to be the same with 8th grade. Scores continue to decline compared to 2022 when the last test was given, with 30% of the students at or above proficient. So very quickly, the older the student gets, the improvements in literacy are not really changing. So with regard to this paradigm shift, what are the critical factors that influence reading improvement? We know the science of reading is important to address some of those issues, but if a comprehensive evidence-based instruction model is to be used, I'm going to make the argument that we have to transcend the science of reading into a more robust paradigm called the cognitive science of learning. It's going to entail on-the-ground environmental needs, in addition to what's going on in children's brains, how it is they're going to be taught, and so forth. So we're going to talk a bit about that. Not to mention the leadership that's going to be required to make those shifts that are going on within public education. And we're going to get into some of the steps necessary to do that based upon the history that we've been working on here at Lindamood-Bell in addressing the needs of these kids in public in educational environments. There's an article that recently came out, and I'm just going to read this quote to make the point. Dr. Jason Yateman and his colleague at Stanford University, in an article that they just wrote, the power for testing causal models has ushered in a paradigm shift in our understanding of the neural circuits. It is similarly possible to fully control the environment and examine how different experiences induce changes in the brain. Think about this in terms of the research that we've poured into this, clearing back to the turn of the century. There's just a laundry list. I'm not going to go all over all this in terms of federal initiatives that have tried to address improvements in reading across the United States. It's totaled up to date, and there's, the feds have still been spending money on this for about $9 billion. All that money has been poured into it. What do we have to show for it? There's the quick history. We went through in 75, the Individuals with Disabilities Act. In one of the main components that's been the underlying layment for the science of reading is what's been referred to as the simple view of reading. We went through the reading wars. In the year 2000, the National Reading Panel report came out with the 5 pillars of reading. In 2002, part of No Child, actually it was before No Child Left Behind, the Institute for Educational Science was formed. And now we're into the Every Student Succeed Act. Notwithstanding all of that, the critical factors, the key takeaways from the NAAP are as follows. The decline in reading scores was driven largely by lower performing students who have been on a downward trend for years. In other words, Title I schools, where a lot of that money has been appropriated, it hasn't been working. The real takeaway is that the urgent, and this was from the federal government, urgent attention was needed, and experts are emphasizing the need for urgent attention to support the nation's lowest performing students. Well, what are the other variables that have to be looked at? There's a more sophisticated science, and it really falls back to what many of you will remember as the old nature and nurture question. When you talk about the science of reading, it by default kind of refers to, well, how do you teach reading? But the science of reading is really has been largely predicated on the nature issue of what children need from a brain processing standpoint. Reading, memory, linguistics, educational environments started revealing new evidence on things that have to be controlled for, which led to the science of reading. And starting in the 60s, from a multidisciplinary standpoint, we're now thinking that a better way to refer to this is entering into what can be called the cognitive science of learning. In other words, shifting to a more comprehensive, evidence-based theoretical model. You all remember the 5 pillars. The science of reading advocates those, and that's a good thing. The question is, what is it going to take beyond that? Because this has been in place since the year 2000, and again, the needle has not moved. In the current paradigm, the federal government has has evolved into advocating what's referred to as evidence-based solutions. Evidence-based interventions now show that significantly more individuals can learn to read and comprehend to their potential. We've been making this argument for going on 4 decades, including those qualifying for special ed and or diagnosed with dyslexia. We're going to talk about that. I'm actually going to feature some current work that we're doing that will address the ability for students to learn to their potential. So here's some questions. If you're thinking about evidence-based, the 38-year journey that we've been on trying to figure out more comprehensive ways to address the needs of students is grounded in these questions. Is there a multisensory function that is foundational to memory and comprehension, as phonemic awareness and orthographic awareness are foundational to decoding? We know about that. That information about phonological processing, the alphabetic code has been around forever. Well, what is the key term used to address interventions for comprehension? In other words, is there a brain function that corresponds to being able to comprehend such that phonemic awareness and orthographic or alphabetic coded language interventions address being able to decode print? We like to refer this as related to sensory cognitive instructions. It's more, after all, what is the more important artifact of teaching children to read? Well, it's, do they comprehend? And what if they can't? We refer to the sensory cognitive function of being able to comprehend as concept imagery, mental representations, if you will, the second code necessary for comprehension. As it turns out, clear back in the 70s, the initial work done on this by this gentleman here in the cognitive science of learning, Pavio's dual coding theory. Simply put, cognition is proportional to the extent that the coding mechanisms of imagery, mental representations or imagery, and language are integrated. His proposition is that linguistic and cognitive competence and performance, including dyslexia, are mediated by the sensory input of mental representations. Let me just break that down just a little bit. Phonological processing and whether or not you can track the number and order of letters and combination of letters and syllables are mental representations, but to expand upon that, it turns out theoretically it's the same for being able to comprehend, generating mental representations from a conceptual standpoint. Indeed, in the 7th edition of this particular book on theoretical models and processes of literacy, it's referred to as follows. DCT is among the strongest current candidates for developing a unified, scientifically based theory of literacy. And we're talking about more than just reading. We're talking about literacy beyond just decoding print. Let's talk about it from the context of both oral language processing as well as written language processing. DCT principles apply to grapheme, phoneme correspondences, vocabulary, grammar, the construction of mental models of text episodes, and imaginative responses to text, including social constructions of self and others in literacy encounters. The DCT model addresses decoding as well as oral and written language comprehension and memory. So, from a professional development standpoint, if this is true, then that's the kind of thing that we need to expand upon as we address professional development in public education. So how does dual coding theory look relative to teaching reading and addressing learning from a more comprehensive standpoint? Back to our journey. We have evolved, we think, well beyond the science of reading, where we have landed in cognitive and behavioral neurosciences. There you see the current political structure and the policy outline on the demands for scientifically based evidence, and I forget how it is. There's 40-some now states who are mandating the use of the science of reading. We're proposing a theory that's structured around new evidence, a new paradigm. A long time ago, we were looking at this just in this simple Venn diagram, where sensory cognitive functions underline the component parts of reading. And there you see the common ones: phonemic awareness, orthographic awareness. Those are based on this substrate of mental representations, or imagery for short. When we look at word attack, the auditory ability to perceive the number, order, and sequence of sounds within syllables, the orthographic component of holding alphabetic code in orthographic mapping, as is being talked about currently. And then, of course, for comprehension, it requires excellent oral vocabulary, also predicated on the ability to create mental representations. There's the formal definition of those. You all know, and what we're actually referring to in orthographic processing is referred to as symbol imagery, the ability to create mental representations for sounds and letters in words. But beyond that, at the risk of repeating myself, is concept imagery, the ability to create an image gestalt or whole for oral and written language paired with language expression. In other words, verbalization. You finish this phrase. We've all used it. A picture's worth what? 1,000 words. We intuitively know that we create mental representations to try and remember what we read. So it's an artifact not only of comprehension, but the underlying layment of memory systems. This cognitive science of learning, there you see it, whether it's in parts or wholes, between symbolically processing print or the sounds of words, as well as dealing with the information from a conceptual standpoint. In other words, there's a proportional relationship what we're arguing between how well we can create mental representations in both of these domains as related to how well we're performing in our literacy tasks. To give you some statistics that go along with this, since 2008, we've been tracking data exclusively in students that come through any number of our learning centers throughout the United States, indeed in Australia and the UK as well. If we parse this out and say, well, what percentage of our students have math, decoding, comprehension, or some combination of decoding and comprehension issues? This information based upon those students who received instruction in one of our learning centers across the United States and elsewhere. What you see there is the decoding and comprehension in yellow. 30% of the kids that we see that come in who are exhibiting at-risk reading behaviors have some combination of both of these factors. In other words, the science is now sophisticated enough, not just looking at decoding, but is there some combination of both these factors? And then you see, as you would expect, 44% of the kids that we see exclusively have issues where decoding is concerned. And then 24% are in that category of exclusively addressing their needs in the area of comprehension. So when we're looking at symbol imagery and decoding for reading and spelling, the instruction revolves around, and the science of reading typically supports all this, making sure that the students can perceive auditorily and visually the number, order, and sequence of sounds and or letters and words. And we instruct based on those criteria. But what happens when it comes to addressing the children who have comprehension deficits? The big word out there is that everybody uses the word strategies. We're going to use all kinds of different strategies to try and stimulate children's ability to comprehend. But the question I posed earlier was, what goes to comprehension from a neurological standpoint, such as phonemic awareness, for example, goes to the ability to decode. We now know the neural architecture of what's required for us to be able to comprehend not only written language, but oral language as well, and it can be taught. So when you take students to the point where you're expecting them to get the main idea, draw conclusions, inferences, and so forth, the predicate for that is whether or not they can generate a mental representation from what they've read or what it is that they've heard. If we look at this from a symptomatic standpoint, this should be familiar to all of you. If you're thinking about the decoding component of it, where the science of reading is trying to address that, symptomatically, we're looking at word attack, word recognition, and all based upon weak phonological and or orthographic spelling issues, difficulty reading fluently in contextual environments. And if the issue is severe enough, then we categorize those students as having dyslexia. This is not as clearly understood and is part of the new paradigm that we're suggesting. It's that the cognitive science of learning needs to also embrace very specific symptoms that are associated with students who have no decoding problems, but rather have difficulty comprehend what it is that they have heard or what it is that they've read. The two outstanding ones would be, in spite of decoding issues, their written language and oral language comprehension is not up to age and or grade level. They have difficulty with critical, logical, and abstract thinking, following directions, expressing language orally. The list goes on and on and on. And from a social emotional standpoint, it actually even affects behavior in terms of being able to do something as simple as grass humor. We've heard the phrase going in one ear and out the other. What is it that causes that? Again, the proposition is that it's related directly to their ability to generate mental representations. And from an instructional standpoint, we have evidence to show that that is a skill that can be taught just the same as students can be stimulated in terms of the development of their phonemic awareness and orthographic processing. I'm not going to go into all this. This information is available on our website, but in sum, we have been looking at this for now going on 30 years, trying to figure out from a neuroscientific research standpoint with these institutions having been published a number of papers relative to these concepts on sensory cognitive processing and what are the artifacts of that when we do neuroscientific behavioral intervention, randomized control kinds of studies to see whether or not we can affect that. I'm going to talk to you about one aspect of the work and the outcomes that we've been able to achieve relative to dyslexia. Let's talk about some of the significant findings then. Changes as part of all this work that we've done with our university collaborators, we're seeing changes in white matter and dosage amounts that correlate to changes in reading behavior. In other words, we can now measure brain changes that correspond to corresponding changes in improved reading behavior. The intervention's positive efficacy in developing dyslexic readers, for example, again, what we're calling sensory cognitive functions, we're seeing those evidence in those particular areas. And with these findings suggesting the universality of phonemic awareness and orthographic awareness processing with dyslexic profile. Why do we pick dyslexic profiles? Well, again, quoting Jason Yateman, who's one of our partners up at Stanford University, he works in he's the director of the Brain Development and Educational Lab at Stanford University, by the way, and also working in collaboration with the Graduate School of Education up there. This is the encouraging part. While many parents and teachers might worry that dyslexia is permanent, reflecting intrinsic deficits in the brain, these findings demonstrate that targeted intensive reading programs, and he's making the statement exclusively based upon the research that we've done with him, they not only lead to substantial improvements in reading skills, but also change the underlying wiring of the brain's reading circuitry. We now have evidence of that. Why does that matter? How do the cognitive science of learning and the use of what we're calling dual coding theory affect dyslexia? And I need to contrast something here that's really important. This was recent, back in March of this year, in an excerpt on an article in Education Week entitled, What Educators Need to Know About Dyslexia and Why It's Not Something to Fix. Please take this into consideration because this is a prevailing mentality that's still out there in contrast to what Dr. Yateman said at Stanford University based on the research that we were just finishing. Curing dyslexia, and I'm quoting out of the article, isn't an option, say experts. But with today's resources, there's a lot of reason for optimism. To go further, having been in the field, I'm just quoting one of the experts out of this article, having been in the field for close to 40 years, I can tell you that dyslexia is a lifelong neurodevelopmental disability that affects how the brain processes language. It has no cure, said Ben Schifrin, head of the Gemini School, a college preparatory independent school serving students with dyslexia. That's a prevailing view out there. Contrary to what Dr. Yateman has suggested, it's that we now have evidence, and I'm going to show you what it is that we've learned in contrast to that statement. Linguistic, cognitive competence, and performance, including dyslexia, are mediated by the sensory input of mental representations for sounds, phonetic processing, and letters or orthographic processing. In other words, if the right instructional techniques can be used to address those deficits, can those deficits be remediated? So we've been engaged in a study on this. We've served over 30,000 students since 2008, and digging into that pie chart that I showed you earlier about the students who have this decoding issue, 44% of those students, there's over 12,000 of the kids that we've looked at, 9,000 of those students had no previous diagnosis of dyslexia, but guess what? They had a dyslexic profile. Indeed, 3,300 of those students did come to us having been previously diagnosed with dyslexia. So the research question on the table was, we put them in instruction, can we affect their profile so they no longer have a dyslexic profile? When we look at all of those students in combination with the students in our research that we served through Stanford University, if you look at symbol imagery, orthographic processing on these tests, phonological awareness, word attack, word recognition, fluency, comprehension, and vocabulary, in all of those students, in the undiagnosed, the diagnosed, and the students that were part of our neuroscientific study, there were 72 of those. Some of that information has been widely published already. What were the effects? So if we look at the standard score changes across all of those populations, you can see that they're essentially comparable. When we look a little bit differently, the 1,400 dyslexic students in our learning centers, less the 72 participants from the University in Washington, Stanford experiments that we've been engaged in, demonstrated reading progress statistically significant to that of the students in the neuroscientific interventions at the University of Washington and Stanford. In other words, in both a clinical, tightly controlled research situation, as well as in our clinical settings in our centers, we're seeing comparable growth between those two populations. And here's the powerful takeaway from it. Can we normalize reading behavior for dyslexic students, all of which fit a dyslexic profile? For example, in word recognition, when we look at whether or not there's an increase, by an increase, are we looking at being able to get students out of that lowest quartile in their word recognition into a normal range of functioning? And as you can see, for all the students, right at about 70% of the students, we've been able to get out of that lowest quartile in their decoding ability in terms of real words. What about comprehension? Well, if students can decode more effectively, what would you expect on the comprehension side? Again, for all of these categories, when we look at these students consistently, we're seeing dramatic changes in their comprehension. Said differently, questioned differently, are these students getting remediated? The answer is yes. Are all of them? No. But here's an outstanding question. These were students that received a controlled amount of instruction. What would happen is if we know that we're affecting changes in their brain, what would happen is if we provided more instruction. So where are we on the quartile movement? Students in the first quartile below the 25th percent in measures of decoding having a dyslexic profile. After the intervention, a significant number of those students moved beyond the first grade into a normal range of reading. Are they still dyslexic? No. There's a paradigm shift here. We do not need to accept the proposition that this issue cannot be addressed and remediated for children. The neuroscientific behavioral intervention study show that the intervention's positive efficacy in developing dyslexic readers' sensory cognitive functions and phonemic awareness and symbol imagery are having the positive effects on decoding to the extent that we can expect changes out of those lower quartiles, sometimes with a second or third quartile changes as well. And from a theoretical standpoint, we continue to argue that the findings add validity to the tenets of dual coding theory as a theoretical model, absorbing what people are thinking about as the science of reading, and suggest the universality of phonemic awareness and symbol imagery for both phonological and orthographic processing to address dyslexic profiles. Well, we've talked about comprehension. It applies equally well there. And I'm only going to mention in passing. I'll show you just a couple things. We've got another study, and it's been going on for now over 5 years with the University of Alabama, working with students on the autism spectrum who have language comprehension deficits. In the study with them, there's 6 studies that have been put out on this. And again, you can access those studies online. The findings are that participants with a diagnosis of autism significantly improved their pre to post reading comprehension, while under a controlled environmental situation, the controls did not. The program that we use to address that is called Visualizing and Verbalizing. Fundamentally, it's the practical application of dual coding to teach students consciously, metacognitively, how to visualize what it is that they're reading. In this case, it's with autism children. And what we see, again, is anatomical and neurological changes as associated with these changes in reading behavior, with a significant relationship between changes in reading comprehension abilities as measured on the Great Oral Reading Test and the changes in local conductivity in the Autism Spectrum Disorder experimental group. The more we can change their conductivity in those areas associated with creating mental representations, coupled with language, the better off their comprehension is. I'm not going to read this whole thing. It's available to you, but we're arguing that an established scientific theory beyond just looking at the simple view or the science of reading is now necessary in order to address the needs of children across the United States. Last but not least, have we done any research in public education to address this? The answer is yes. We did a project, and fundamental to the project, and I want to emphasize something more that transcends or that steps out what's going on in the brain to address the needs of students. From a scientific standpoint, we all get paid to change student reading behavior. What are the critical factors? What's the global view? Back to the nature nurture question. We've been talking about nature, but what happens in a nurturing and educational environment that needs to move the needle for children in this situation? Number one, differential diagnosis. And all that really means is if a child is exhibiting substandard reading behavior, there is no further excuse for other than but that we can't get in there, do the diagnosis, and find out what's going wrong. In other words, these reading issues or learning issues can be addressed. Number two, once we know the answer to number one, is that we can customize interventions. That's a really important question, as opposed to just working on decoding. And let's be honest, the science of reading predominantly advocates the necessary artifacts of being able to decode. And that's important, but it's not exclusive. It's not going to move the needle because the children that we saw and the numbers that I showed you previously is that fully 25% of all the kids that come in here don't have any decoding problems. They have language comprehension issues. But we're not done. Now to the nurture part. We know that there are huge environmental controls that need to be in place beyond just the science of reading. And that means we got to take a careful look at what's going on in our public educational system. There are more complicated variables here on what modifications do we need to do in the environment. If you look at environmental issues, what's the primary artifact or variable that's necessary in order to move the needle in environments? Number one, beyond what happens when the children, after the children land in a public educational environment, is the aggregate competencies of the teachers who are addressing the needs of those kids. Teaching kids in a theoretical model that takes a look at all the components necessary for reading is absolutely necessary. Number two is time. how much time, and we all know that the prevailing view in public education is we teach reading, teach kids to read, and then at some point, easing into late elementary environments, then we're teaching them to understand what they read. We start to assume that they can decode, and if they can, then we stop worrying about it. Time is necessary. And if you find that let's just do a comparative analysis, is it possible, statistically speaking, for a child in the second grade to be behind in their reading 6 years? It's impossible. What about an eighth grade student? Is it possible for an eighth grade student to be behind 6 years in the reading? Absolutely. And here's a final question. Take a classroom at any level in public education. What is the diversity of the learning needs within that population of students? They're not all the same. So we've got an environmental issue that needs to be sensitive to differential diagnosis, customized intervention, and we've done successfully set up programs in public education to address that diversity in the environment to meet children where they are in addressing their learning needs. And clearly, it's not going to happen without leadership in those schools and or districts, as well as making sure that parents are co-opted into the process. In sum, to systematically change student performance in reading, what must happen in these environmental categories outside of just teaching reading? The test case. The cognitive science of learning and the use of DCT in an elementary school, critical factors. Given the cognitive diversity and the abilities of children in public education at all grade levels, what makes sense about only having 13 grades to address the diverse language processing needs of so many variables in learning potential profiles? The deeply reasoned, evidence-based explanation of why the 13th grade or K-12 structure makes virtually no cognitive sense from a developmental standpoint. And how does the science of reading address that issue? It's got to be more than just the science of reading, because we're talking about an environmental factor of having a larger bandwidth to address the diverse needs of kids within those populations. We've tested that theory. And the effects in this particular article on the effects of a theoretically based large-scale reading intervention in a multicultural urban school district. And I'm just going to read this. And again, you can get into the detail on this, but I'm only going to highlight it. Way back in '97, before the turn of the century, Lindamood-Bell Learning Processes, we partnered with the Pueblo School District in Pueblo, Colorado, and we examined the achievement in grades 3 to 5 during the years of 98 through 2000. Pueblo School District 60 schools compared statewide. We compared statewide through the series of repeated measures and analysis of variance. By the way, this was independently analyzed out of the Texas A&M University at the tail end of this project. What we saw was statistically significant and increasing gains favoring what Mark Sadowski and Victor Wilson discovered was that the reading interventions that we use were found both overall in the analysis of Title I schools. Here's some of the outline statistics. Within 8 years, over 750 students moved out of special education. And over 9,000 of at-risk students received intensive reading instruction, and over 25,000 students received developmental reading instruction. And by the way, there's only just over 25,000 students in those grade levels across the district. Again, showing statistically significant and increasing gains favoring the dual coding theory-based reading intervention were found both overall and the analysis of Title I schools. We didn't just look at it in terms of pre-post testing. We took a look at the Colorado State academic program on measuring success. Pueblo School District 60 versus other Colorado schools on grade 4 CSAP categories. The values were statistically controlled for in terms of school size, percentage of minority students, percentage of students receiving free and reduced lunches, and within Pueblo schools, linear and quadratic treatment effects due to the year of entry in the intervention. So what you see here, the students over time, the number of students who were unsatisfactory decreased, the number of students who were proficient increased across all 4 categories, and the numbers of advanced students increased. Compare that to what we referred to at the very beginning of this presentation on the NAEP scores. These effects can be completely switched from what it is at a national level we see going on the NAEP scores. The number of unsatisfactory students can be decreased, and the number of proficient students can be increased. The effects as noted in this particular article are as follows. The emphasis on associated language with multisensory mental images is a direct application of dual coding theory. Any theory of reading, and this is the take-home message, a reading or writing that does not eventually align with a broader theory of general cognition will not endure. Reading and writing are cognitive acts. They're not just reading acts. So, what's the history? We've already talked about it. And what is the science or the evidence teaching reading only 9 months out of the year and predominantly in grades K to 5? It's not moving the needle. We have to expand upon the science of reading. It includes a much broader view, a 30,000-foot view, as opposed to just looking at what's going on predominantly in early childhood, and not only within those K-5 environments, but the diversity within that environment of what has to be addressed. If we look at comparatively the simple view of reading, I'm just going to say this one more way. In the simple view of reading, it served as a model for the science of reading. It's just one code. It's language. It doesn't take into consideration the possibility that there's another equally, if not more important code in the cognitive science learning, and we're referring to that as dual coding theory, where we're applying the sensory cognitive functions to all learning, not just reading. In other words, it's 2 codes, the language code and the mental representation codes. Reading is cognition, and cognition is the interplay of mental representations and language, not just language. It's not a single code. The brain's sensory systems are prima facie to language. And the artifacts of the science of reading, decoding, syntax, semantics, morphology are all necessary, but they're not sufficient, as is being argued currently. And by the way, and is being legislated across the United States and multiple states. Artifacts of the science of reading. Well, I won't belabor the point. Finally, decoding, phonology, orthography, memory, and comprehension all fit within the dual coding theory. A final thought. If we measure sensory cognitive processing and we differentiate and diagnose and provide instruction to develop the sensory input of imagery to interplay with language, individuals can become independent in language and literacy skills. I want to thank you for your attention. Here's information in here on how you can reach out to us. If you have questions, you can reach out to me from the professional development side. If those of you who are interested in this particular more advanced look into the cognitive science of learning, feel free to give us a call. Thank you for your time.